floating bodiless in the air, floating a moment and then disappearing. The whispering ceased and the voices and the sounds, and a solemn stillness followed. I waited and listened. I felt that Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Number 428. A panel, 5 feet by 2 feet 3 inches. Formerly the front of a cassone or coffer, intended to contain the garment.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. One thing I was very wary about was the temperamental moods of nature. Before leaving the nest for the first time, my mom had instructed me on flying head-on into a steady stream of wind. One flick of a wing against it, and I would be tumbled beak over toes. Better to use the gales to your advantage to conserve energy. A slight breeze will allow the airfoil of your wings to allow you to soar. Backdrafts allow you to hover in place. I had been excited to try, to make her proud and master the art of soaring and hovering and attacking those pesky starlings that so annoyed us. I had been restless and overly eager to soar like my siblings, and now I pay for foolishness with every rising sun. Our nest was in the crook of branches in a tall sugar pine tree. From it we could see the entire human village that stretched from the shore of the sea to the forest before the gently rolling green foothills of the Cascade Mountains. The purple sky to the west was darkening like a festering bruise, the slate-blue cloud cover thickening. Good. It would be a very dark night. I trembled with impatience and the yearn to feel safe again. Down below, windows brightened as lamps were lit. The intoxicating smells of meats and fish, broiling and stewing that wafted upwards made my beak water. Human food was so much tastier than forest offerings and carrion. The homes to the eastern side of town were bigger and brighter, with large yards groomed neat and tidy with flowering shrubbery, gazebos, and big tasseled umbrellas. The east side refuse bins were brimming with tasty scraps. The homes surrounding my tree were much smaller, with dirt yards planted with vegetable gardens and refuse bins devoid of anything remotely edible. At last, the ebony night had descended around me like the blackness of my mum's wings, a distant memory now, but a soothing one, my happy place. I leapt from the branch and listed to the left as usual, correcting my handicap with my extra strong right wing. As the girl sat by her window, she looked at her drawing for a few seconds, then added more black. There, she thought, he's much more evil now. She growled in her throat like an irritated tomcat when she heard footsteps approaching her door. She swiftly put her drawing in the drawer under the desk and picked up her pink pastel crayon to color in some petals on a page with roses in a sunlit garden, complete with yellow butterflies. "Gar," she said softly as the door opened. She always came in without knocking. "Matilda, dear," her mother said with a nervous twitch at the corners of her mouth, "look who's come to visit." Maddie did not look up. She knew who the visitor was, and she hated him. "Hello, Matilda." The priest's holier-than-thou voice grated on her nerves. It took all her willpower not to bunch her shoulders. "Can you look at me, child?" "No, go away." "She's been like this for 3 days now," her mother said. Father Fairweather said, "That's a very pretty picture, Matilda. You're a very good little artist." She willed herself not to flinch. "I knew you'd like it. And I hate when you call me that. Matilda, dear, can't you look up? Father Fairweather has complimented you." Her mother's shadow fell over her as she leaned over to look at the colorful garden. Then she reached out tentatively and took her daughter's hand and turned it towards her. Maddie felt her mother's chagrin, thick and wonderfully prickly. She pictured her mother's face just then, lips a tight line and eyes blazing under an angry furrowed brow. Maddie's small white hand was coated in black charcoal. Father Fairweather said, "I've brought you a gift, Matilda." Curiosity prevented her from growling again. The tall gray man in black placed a brand new package of pastels on the desk. Maddie couldn't wait to open the package and inhale the waxy, oily smell deeply. The smell was a lot like the kerosene in her lamp. She remained frozen. She always tested herself this way to see how long she could appear comatose, for she was getting very good at it. Father Fairweather turned to leave. His shadow slumped. "I've won." Just before turning to leave as well, her mother snatched up the pastels and opened the small flat box. She closed it and put it back down, then followed the priest out the door. After their footsteps had receded down the stairs, Maddie silently got up and went to the top of the stairs, where she could hear them talking quietly in the living room. After all the years spent in her shell, she developed the hearing of a cat. "Well, at least she's not hurting herself anymore," the priest said. "She seems calm, and the drawings have improved. No more spooky ones." "No," her mother lied. "No more screaming at midnight." "No, well now. We could wait a little longer. Perhaps she'll continue on this positive path." "I suppose. But, can't we try the ritual again?" "No. I'll run away before that again." "Oh, now, Mary." Silence for a minute. Then the priest said, "Well, let me confer with Cardinal Iscariot. I'll be making the monthly passage to Astoria to present our tithe. He's discovered possible possession in 2 recent additions to the orphanage there." No. Maddie stepped on the floorboards nearest the hallway wall, where they creaked hardly at all. In her room, she closed the door, wishing it had a lock. She sat down at her desk and smiled as she picked up the box of pastels and opened the lid. The black one was missing. She wasn't surprised, but she did feel a loathing curl inside her chest, like the larva of a scream ready to burst forth. "Never mind," she thought. "I prefer my charcoals anyways." She brushed the garden to the floor and took the dark one from the drawer. The figure was crooked like an old oak tree, with tattered black rags draped on its limbs. The head was half the size of it, with a gaping maw full of square white teeth. It had holes for eyes under a shadowy hood. They were terrible eyes, she knew. She'd seen them, yellow like candle wax and hypnotic like a cobra's eyes. Her room was small, a bed with a wooden chest before it, a desk by the window, and an armoire. At the base of the armoire, she'd pried a loose board up and inside the small rectangular space. She stashed the things her mother would not understand and take from her. She pulled out a pastel crayon box and opened it. Inside were an assortment of charcoal sticks she'd made herself in varying thicknesses and lengths. She chose a thin one, 4 inches long, and put the rest back. At her desk, she finished drawing the creature's bony, slender hands, the fingers long as brand-new pencils. She shaded them in gray tones by mixing amounts of charcoal with a stub of white pastel. She drew from memory she once thought fictional but now believed to be real. From downstairs, the sound of a broken bottle. "Good. Sleep well, bitch, mother." At last, she looked up from her latest drawing of Bernard, son of a Wendigo and a Canadian native witch named Coco. So Bernard had said. She sat back sleepily and content. It seemed the more she illustrated Bernard, the less he appeared in her dreams, as if he were content to be pictured, immortalized, even admired. She could believe that one such as he were that big-headed to think that. She felt the night pressing at the window. She loved the dark. It calmed her like her charcoal pencils did, and the kerosene scent of her pastels. She felt a draft from the small crack in the sill and turned towards the pane. Her smile flashed away from her face like a bonfire ember in a gust. Her eyes grew round and filled half her face. She stifled a scream, lest her mother fear her possessed again. She'd forgotten she was passed out cold. At the window was a raven peering in at her, its onyx eyes searching hers. I had frightened the girl. I'd come to this house on many nights after learning to fly, in my frustratingly lopsided way. The outside bins were rich with delectable human food scraps. Sometimes chicken legs with only a small bite taken, sometimes sliced beets with melted goat cheese, sometimes lamb bones, the fat untouched. On this night, I know not why, I was beckoned to the window on the top floor overlooking the yard. I was drawn to it. Perhaps when I flew, sideways at first until corrected, and alight upon a branch close to it, I'd seen a small, pale face staring out into the night. She was smiling. I could see she loved the night as much as I. Ravens are not creatures of the night by trade. They roost at night, like most birds do. I was not like most ravens. Ever since that fateful day of my first flight from my nest, I thought I was as strong as my siblings and as strong as my mum wished me to be. But when I leapt from the nest the first time, my right wing obeyed. My left was not so much. The breeze that should have caught my airfoil instead tumbled me beak to toes, and I fell. On the ground I cried for my mum, but she shook her head, ashamed, and turned her back to me. I knew what happened to runts and the infirmed amongst our kind. My uncle had been born with a club foot. He could fly, but was ever pursued by his own kin until at last they'd attacked enmity and pecked out his eyes and shat on his back, leaving him to die alone and blind and dirty. I was not about to suffer his fate. I hid myself in the daylight. In the night, I became part of it. Perhaps because of my handicap, my night vision grew. As I looked into the window, I could see the girl was terrified. What? Of me? I didn't understand, but I felt bad. She was also a creature of the night. I could see it in her expression as she looked out and up into the skies. I crouched in supplication and tried to look into her eyes so I could read her and perhaps she could read me. Maddie suppressed the screaming she felt like that snake was now eager to be free. No, she thought. The Cardinal Iscariot would tie her down again and the torture would be worse than before. Bernard was big and huge and wanting her to come with him. A raven. At my window. She'd seen it peering at her, cocking its head to try and catch her eye. Bernard. In raven form. It has to be. Maddie knew most birds roost at night. It was as odd to see a bird at night as it was to see a raccoon in the daylight. Bernard, that evil demon. In bird form, she thought again and shivered. Maybe she should let the Cardinal torture her to death. Life was just so. Tap, tap. It was back, but she wouldn't let it in. From the time she was an infant, she hated to be touched. The touch of a hand brought shards of electric pain to her new pink skin. She'd hoped it would fade, but it did not. To be enveloped into arms was to be thrown into the sky as a sacrifice. Lightning bolts searing and sizzling until she felt too exhausted to speak or move. Eventually, people stopped touching her. If she ignored them, they turned away and she was at peace. One day, her mother had brought the priest. He'd tied her down and said a bunch of bullshit words, and Bernard had come to her rescue, whispering to her, "Just lie still. Smile. No more screaming. Just worship me and someday I'll come and take you from all this pain." She had done as he said, and she dreamt of him, and drew pictures of him in homage. It had been enough until now. Here he was in raven form. What did he want? She came back to the window as I tapped again. She breathed heavily and looked into my eyes, looking for something, searching. She opened the window and I crouched low to make myself smaller, meeker. I looked up at her, feigning weakness and not sure why I was here or why so drawn to her. She said, "Bernard, it's okay. I'm ready to go. Take me away." I thought, Bernard, and hopped into her room. I understood then that she feared something I was not. I made my decision. If she were to wring my neck, so be it. But I truly believed I'd at last found a kindred spirit. I hopped to her desk and crouched low, turning my head away because she seemed afraid to look into my eyes. I closed my eyes. I prepared for execution or eye gouging as my siblings had tried so long ago. I felt a gentle touch on my feathers. The ones on my neck and I cooed like a dove and bowed even lower, purring like a kitten. It was heaven to feel love through a hand, a touch I'd never felt before. The huge black bird in Maddie's hands curled up and nestled close to her. "Oh, my goodness," she said quietly. "You're not evil at all. You've been sent to me to protect me from Bernard." The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, its hues are as various as the hues of the arch. As distinct too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow. How is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness, from the covenant of peace a simile of sorrow? But as, in ethics, evil is a consequence of good, so in fact, out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which are have their origin in the ecstasies which might have been. My baptismal name is Aegeus. That of my family I will not mention. Yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than my gloomy, grey hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking particulars, in the character of the family mansion, in the frescoes of the chief's saloon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiselling of some buttresses in the armory, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the passion of the library chamber, and lastly, in the very peculiar nature of the library's contents, there is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollections of my earliest years are connected with that chamber, and with its volumes, of which latter I will say no more. Here died my mother. Herein was I born. But it is mere idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul has no previous existence. You deny it? Let us not argue the matter. Convinced myself, I seek not to convince. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial forms, of spiritual and meaning eyes, of sounds musical yet sad, a remembrance which will not be excluded, a memory like shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow too, in the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber I was born, thus awakening from the long night of what seemed but was not, non-entity, at once into the very regions of fairyland, into a place of imagination, into the wild dominions of monastic thought and erudition. It is not singular that I gazed around me with a startled and ardent eye, that I loitered away my boyhood in books and dissipated my youth in reverie. But it is singular that as the years rolled away, and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers, it is wonderful what stagnation there fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total an inversion took place in the character of my commonest thought. The realities of the world affected me as visions, and as visions only, while the wild ideas of the land of dreams became in turn, not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew, I ill of health and buried in gloom, she agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister, I living within my own heart and addicted body and soul to the most intense and painful meditation. She, roaming carelessly through life with no thought of the shadows in her path, or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice, I call upon her name, Berenice, and from the grey ruins of memory 1,000 tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Ah, vividly is her image before me now, as in the early days of her light-heartedness and joy. Oh, gorgeous yet fantastic beauty, O sylph amid shrubberies of Arnheim, O naiad amongst its fountains. And then all is mystery and terror, and a tale which should not be told. Disease, a fatal disease, fell like the simoom upon her frame, and even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, and her character, and in a manner the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where was she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous train of maladies superinduced by that fatal and primary one which effected a revolution of so horrible a kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate in its nature, a species of epilepsy not unfrequently terminating in trance itself. Trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was, in most instances, startlingly abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation, my own disease, then, grew rapidly upon me, and assumed finally a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momently gaining vigour, and at length obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear indeed that it is in no manner possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reader an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest, which in my case, the powers of meditation, not to speak technically, busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. To muse for long unwearied hours with my attention riveted to some frivolous device on the margin or in the typography of a book. To become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadow falling aslant upon the tapestry or upon the door. To lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire. To dream away whole days over the perfume of a flower. To repeat monotonously some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, ceased to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion and physical existence, by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obstinately persevered in. Such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries induced by a condition of the mental faculties, not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue, earnest, and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that ruminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in by persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as might first be supposed, an extreme condition, or exaggeration of such propensity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. In the one instance, the dreamer or enthusiast, being interested by an object usually not frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of this object in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom until, at the conclusion of a daydream often replete with luxury, he finds the incitamentum or first cause of his musings entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, though assuming through the medium of my distempered vision a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and those few pertinaciously returning in upon the original object as a centre. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind more particularly exercised were with me, as I have said before, the attentive, and are with the daydreamer, the speculative. My books at this epoch, if they did not actually serve to irritate the disorder, partook, it will be perceived, largely, in their imaginative and inconsequential nature, of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I well remember, among others, the treatise of the noble Italian Curius Secundus Curio, De Amplitudine Beati Regni Dei, St. Austin's great work, The City of God, and Tertullian's De Carne Christi, in which the paradoxical sentence, mortuus est Dei filius, credibili et quia ineptum est, et sepultus resurrexit, certum est quia impossibili est, occupied my undivided time for many weeks of laborious and fruitless investigation. Thus it will appear that, shaken from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore resemblance to that ocean crag spoken of by Ptolemy Hephaestion, which, steadily resisting the attacks of human violence and the fiercer fury of the waters and the winds, trembled only to the touch of the flower called asphodel. And although to a careless thinker it might appear a matter beyond doubt, that the alteration produced by her unhappy malady in the moral condition of Berenice would afford me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation whose nature I have been at some trouble in explaining, yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder frequently and bitterly upon the wonder-working means by which so strange a revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasy of my disease, and were such as would have occurred under similar circumstances to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder revelled in the less important but more startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, in the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. Through the grey of the early morning, among the trellised shadows of the forest at noonday, and in the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her. Not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream. Not as a being of the earth, earthly, but as the abstraction of such a being. Not as a thing to admire, but to analyze. Not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse though desultory speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence, and grew pale at her approach. Yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition, I called to mind that she had loved me long, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials was approaching, when upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, one of those unseasonably warm, calm and misty days which are the nurse of the beautiful halcyon, I sat as I thought alone, in the inner apartment of the library, but uplifting my eyes I saw that Berenice stood before me. Was it my own excited imagination, or the mystic influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the grey draperies which fell around her figure that caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline? I could not tell. She spoke no word, and I, not for worlds could I have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame, a sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me, a consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and sinking back upon the chair I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in any single line of the contour. My burning glances at last fell upon the face. The forehead was high and very pale and singularly placid, and the once jetty hair fell partially over it, and overshadowed the hollow temples with innumerable ringlets now of a vivid yellow, and jarring discordantly in their fantastic character with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless and lustreless and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar meaning, the teeth of the challenged Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God I had never beheld them, or that having done so, I had died. The shutting of a door disturbed me, and looking up, I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber. But from the disordered chamber of my brain had it not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away, the white and ghastly spectrum of the teeth. Not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges. But what that period of her smile had sufficed to blend in upon my memory. I saw them now even more unequivocally than I had beheld them then. The teeth! The teeth! They were here and there and everywhere and visibly and palpably before me, long, narrow, and excessively white, with the pale lips writhing about them, as in the very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strange and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them in imagination a sensitive and sentient power, and even when unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression. Of Mademoiselle Salle it has been well said, que tout c'est pas étaient des sentiments, and of Berenice I more seriously believed que tout c'est dont étaient des idées. Des idées! Ah, here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me. Des idées! Ah, therefore it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could alone ever restore me to peace in giving me back to reason. And the evening closed in upon me thus, and then the darkness came, and tarried, and went, and the day again dawned, and the mists of a second night were now gathering around. And still I sat motionless in that solitary room, and still I sat buried in meditation, and still the phantasma of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy as, with the most vivid and hideous distinctness, it floated about amid the changing lights and shadows of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams as a cry of horror and dismay, and thereunto after a pause succeeded the sound of troubled voices, intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow or of pain. I arose from my seat, and throwing open one of the doors of the library, saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She had been seized with epilepsy in the early morning, and now at the closing in of the night the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library, and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension, yet its memory was replete with horror. Horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I strived to decipher them, but in vain, while ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before, for it was the property of the family physician. But how came it there, upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were the singular but simple ones of the poet Ibn Zayat. Decebunt mihi sodalis, si sepulchrum amicae visitarum, curus meas aliquantulum fore levitas. Why then, as I perused them, did the hairs of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body become congealed within my veins? There came a light at the library door, and pale as the tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound, and then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek I bounded to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it, but I could not force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces, and rolling from it with a rattling sound rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Mark drives down the foggy dirt road in his black Jeep. The dirt under his tires shoots up from beneath them as they try to cling to the ground. He can barely see a few feet in front of him. A stream ran off the side of him, following the side of the road. The headlights are the only light in the road. No city lights reach all the way out here in the middle of nowhere. He is driving to his aunt's house in the middle of the Gunnison National Forest in Colorado. She sounded spooked when she called him, but the line broke up before she could say what the problem was, and Mark rushed out of his house with only a single bottle of water. That was 2 hours ago. If only she didn't live in an inholding in the middle of a national forest. He'd be lucky to find her house, even though he has been there multiple times. He checks his gas and notices it is close to empty. Damn, he was in too much of a rush and could barely think about anything. He just knew his aunt wasn't okay, and all he could think about was getting out there to help her. He already lost his mom, and his dad hasn't spoken to him for years because Mark didn't believe in God. The blood flow slows a little just as his eyes close and everything goes dark. Like there could be any ghosts or anything like that. What you see is what we get, Dad. He hopes the gas will hold up until he can find her place. It is already 11 at night, and he barely got any sleep last night because of his stupid neighbors screaming at Call of Duty all night. He pounded on their door, but they couldn't hear him. The headphones were probably noise-canceling. He rubs his eyes and blinks them a few times in an attempt to stay awake. He hasn't seen a single car for at least the past hour, just his own headlights in the road in front of him. Where was he? He hasn't seen that broken-down shed the last time he came up here, albeit it has been a while. The road continues to get more and more broken down. Grass starts to seep into it, making it one with nature. The dirt is mixed with a sandy substance now as well. Mark shoots his head to his right as something glows out of the corner of his eye. He strains his eyes to see what it was, but nothing is there. The only thing he can see past the darkness is the first line of tall trees. He shakes his head and continues driving down the road. He expects, hopes. Any minutes he will turn a corner and pull into his aunt's property, but something in the pit of his stomach tells him he took the wrong turn a long ways back. And ever since he suspected this, he has tried to get a map on his phone, but the service is terrible out here. He remembers his father's words like he had just said them yesterday. God will show you the way. Follow his light and you will come out on top. Yeah, well, if he would show me the way, I wouldn't even be in this mess in the first place. He would have just let me go to bed in peace. With a thud and a last gasp, his car comes slowly to a halt. Mark hits the steering wheel and grabs his phone and turns on the flashlight. The gas tank is empty. He opens the door and steps out into the cold night. A chill runs down his spine, planting him in that spot, cementing him to the floor. He brings his arms together for a hug to make himself warm, and then he looks out into the forest and spots another glow for a split second before it disappears again. A cougar. A bear. Mark moves again and pushes towards the back of his car for the gas tank he always keeps in it. He aims the flashlight in the trunk of the car through the window and sees nothing. Confused, he opens the trunk and the lights turn on. Nothing is back there. Just what I needed. He kicks the car's tire and immediately regrets it when he gets a big throb of pain. Damn it. He checks around himself once again as the needles on his neck shoot out. He can feel a presence watching him. It has to be some sort of animal. Hopefully, it isn't hungry. Mark walks back to the front of the car as a breeze picks up, sending his t-shirt to flap in the wind against his belly. "Where the hell is your house, Auntie?" He screams into the night, hoping someone would hear him, or at least scare off the predators in the dark. Who was he kidding? Nobody is crazy enough to live out here in the middle of nowhere, except his God-loving family, who think God will save them on a whim. Suddenly, a dark shadow flies past Mark's head, scaring him, as he falls backwards and trips on a stone. His elbow smashes the window to the front driver's seat. Glass falls all over the seat and blood streams from Mark's arm. The blood falls onto the seat and dirt ground when he pulls it back out. He grits his teeth and holds his arm, trying to stop the blood flow, but it won't stop. His breathing is faster as his heart beats in his chest. The blood pushes out from his arm in time with his heart. Does that mean it's an artery? Mark's vision fades in and out. He falls to his knees as the world around him starts to turn upside down. He pulls his shirt off, fumbling with his shaky hands, and rips it, creating a rag and ties it around his arm where the wound is. The blood flow slows a little just as his eyes close and everything goes dark. Darker than a forest in the middle of nowhere with no light pollution. Darker than the devil's soul. Darker than the dirt he sits on, hoping he did enough. Mark shoots away because something in the darkness scurries off into the forest, shooting dirt up at his face as it runs. Mark, still dizzy, feels his arm. Pain shoots throughout it as he feels the blood-soaked shirt. This won't last. He pulls himself up by grabbing onto the door handle and looks around. It is still dark out and even colder now, as he can feel the chill creep deep inside his bones. The pinpricks in his skin tell him hypothermia can set in, especially because of this fog making him slightly wet. He grabs the other part of his shirt and wraps it over the first rag. Mark then searches for his phone on the ground and finally finds it tucked underneath the tire. He tries to call 911, but once again it says, "No service." Aren't these damn things supposed to work anywhere? Mark almost throws the phone off into the trees, but then decides against it and turns on the flashlight on the phone. The feeling of terror comes back to him, but just for a moment as he looks into the trees surrounding him. He has to go find help, maybe even stumble upon his aunt's house. She can't be too far away. He knows she's out here somewhere. Mark picks a direction that seems most likely to be where his aunt would be in, and walks into the forest, through shrubs, tall grass, branches, and a trail of blood following him. Hopefully the animal is gone, or else he will be a nice early morning breakfast for whatever was following him earlier. Just one step after another. He is so weak and thirsty and frozen. It was stupid to not bring anything with him, but his aunt sounded scared. He just wanted to help her. She is the one person who hasn't abandoned him. She believes he will be saved by God and he will forgive Mark. But Mark doesn't care. He just cares that she still loves him, and he knows he has to find her and help her, bloody arm or not. Mark steps on a rock and loses his balance, falling to the ground. He lands on his good arm and picks himself back up. He notices his mouth is dry. He hasn't had anything to drink since he left. He walks forward again, but sees that whatever he tripped on isn't a rock. It's hard to make out in the dark, but as soon as his phone light shines on the object, he jumps backwards, almost falling over once again. He looks around for an explanation or the person responsible. There is no skin. It is just bone. So why would they be around here anymore? They are long gone, right? Mark stares at the skull of what used to be a human. It sticks out of the dirt, half embedded in it. Mark notices what is around him. A clearing juts out ahead, mostly of rock and dirt. A few heavy machinery and other equipment lie around on the ground. The fog is only deeper now, making it hard to see what is what. Just then, Mark notices a movement come from the side of one bulldozer in the clearing, and then moves behind it. It was a man that looked as if he was glowing, almost as if he was glowing from inside himself. "Hey, sir, I'm lost. I could use some help." Mark runs over towards the truck as the ground turns more wet, making Mark slip and slide on the mud. "Please, I need some water." Mark turns the corner behind the bulldozer, but nobody is there. He looks around, confused. Where could the man have gone? Behind the bulldozer is a big clearing, and to the left is a small mountainside. Jackets lay on the floor, and lunchboxes are sprawled all over the place. Half-eaten sandwiches with mold growing on them sit inside. A chainsaw lies on a large rock, and next to it is an upside-down construction helmet. Bloodstains coat the helmet red. Chunks pooled and dried in the inside of it. What the hell? Mark swallows his fear and continues his search for safety. It is like this place was suddenly evacuated. Like everybody here just up and vanished. Chills run down Mark's spine, making his arms shoot out with pain. This place feels off, like someone is watching him. Like something dark happened here, and if he doesn't leave, it will happen to him as well. But that is stupid to think. What could possibly happen to him that is worse than bleeding out in the middle of a dark forest with no way to call for help? Nothing bad happened here. They probably just cut themselves on something and the blood pooled in the helmet and they all left because the job was called off. Right? No. Then why leave all the equipment? Maybe for a night, but it feels like it's been a lot longer than that. The feeling of being watched comes back over him as he searches through the bulldozer's windows. He spots a bottle of water. He looks around him, back to the forest surrounding the clearing, and then opens the door to the bulldozer and steps inside. He grabs the half-empty water and chugs it, not caring if it's infected with disease. His dry throat fills with the water, but the cracks and desert-like feelings stay. It didn't help. He needs to find his aunt. Suddenly, his heart beats fast and a pure feeling of adrenaline and fear rolls through his body much more intensely than before. He hears sounds coming from far off in the distance in the woods somewhere. People are out there. They could help him. Just as he tries to leave the truck, the door slams shut in front of him. He tries to open it, but it won't budge. He looks all around him through the windows as the screams of people get even louder and more focused. It is like they are right in front of him now. Screaming, crying. He hears lots of footsteps running on the forest floor. Mark looks around, but everything is still completely dark. Darker even than when he was outside as the light from his phone glares so he can only see himself through the window. His heart beats faster as he fumbles with his phone, trying to turn off the light. This isn't funny. Someone better let me out of here. Mark's chest feels as if it will explode. His bandaged arm starts to bleed all over the inside of the bulldozer. He has to calm down or else he will bleed out in here, but he can't. His breathing is rapid, like he just ran 10 miles. His head is on fire, every neuron firing. Finally, his shaky hands turn off the light. Outside stand these white figures in mining clothes from a long time ago. They are covered in dust and dirt. The screaming is even louder now as Mark tries to cover his ears, but it only makes it louder. His head feels like it is going to explode. An army of white, almost see-through. People surround the bulldozer. "Who are you?" Mark screams. They just stare at Mark with frowns. Mark just then notices some of them have missing arms. Some have parts of their face missing, chunks just gone. This has to be a joke, right? He searches the cabin of the truck for a secret screen or camera when all the ghosts take one step forward towards Mark at the same time. The screaming and crying persists. Mark's heart has never beat faster as his vision goes in and out. Save us. Our land. Let us rest in peace. A hand appears on the side of the truck's window, making Mark jump out of the seat and move away from it. Mark looks around him in a circle, back and forth from each ghost to the next. He doesn't know what to do. He can feel the fear in chest, his imminent death. The screaming, the crying, the pain. Mark starts to recite the Hail Mary as best as he can remember it. Suddenly, a loud explosion sounds out, and he hides down below the windows as a bright flash lights up the outside. The truck shakes. He can't see anything for a few seconds, and then it is dark again. Everything is quiet. No sounds. No movement. The fear has been released. Mark looks up and over the console of the truck and sees nothing but the clearing of mud and dirt. He can hear the insects chirp away through the truck. The night sky is clear and vibrant with stars. Mark grabs his shoulder and, without thought, opens the door to the bulldozer and jumps out. He is still shaking. What just happened to him? A light turns on above the small mountaintop, and he can slightly see an older woman standing on the porch of a house. He smiles, "Auntie." When he reaches the top of the mountainside, he is still shaking and his arm hurts like hell. But he made it. Mark, what happened? Come inside. His aunt grabs him and helps him inside her small cabin. He sits in a living room with shelves of pictures of family. Books line one of the walls, one of them being the Bible. A fire is going, lighting up the room, a nice, glowing orange. Mark's aunt hands him a glass of tea and puts a blanket over his back. He just stares ahead at the wall, not blinking. I called an ambulance. They are on their way. Mark doesn't move, Mark. Mark looks towards her at the floor. There were so many of them. I could see through their bodies, young men, older men, missing limbs. I could barely breathe. It was so loud. What do you mean? What happened? His aunt sits down next to him on the sofa and puts an arm around him. Is this about the site they are digging up? I told them not to. They are not letting the dead rest in peace. His aunt smiles. He just stares ahead at the wall. A long time ago, there was a mining accident down there. Plenty of people died in a large explosion. Mark shudders in fear. Are you okay? I believe, Auntie. I believe in God. Mark puts down his tea on the table in front of him and suddenly looks worried. Why did you call me earlier? Is everything all right? His aunt looks at him, confused, and then shines with a smile. Oh, yes. I just wanted to share an amazing cookie recipe I found. Mark looks at her with a blank stare and then smiles and laughs. I came all the way through that, just for cookies. They both laugh and hug each other as the ghosts watch from the canyon below, knowing that Mark will help them find peace. He did. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories. Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. On the surface, Grazer's Knoll seems like a typical picturesque small town, a little slice of antique Americana on the north end of the Sacramento Valley. The men are strong and stoic. Almost all work down at the lumber mill. The women are lovingly stern, a powerful matriarch. It's no secret that the sewing circles of the Knoll run the show. Kenny was a good kid, the youngest of 4. At 10, he could already hold his own with some of the tougher chores required around the farm. He'd been in his fair share of dust-ups with some of the older boys around town, but for the most part he was well behaved. He never complained about his studies or his siblings and always kept his church clothes clean. Not to say that he didn't get into some mischief now and again. His 2 older brothers and sister were all in their teens. The trouble they caused cast a tall shadow over any of the questionable deeds he got up to. They all pretended to fear their father, but they all knew who the real heavy hand of the family was. Mother, when things got serious, she never raised her voice or the belt, but spoke with an eerie calm and a tone of finality that put all arguments to bed before they arose. She was the unquestioned voice of authority. It's not that she was particularly stern. In fact, when it came to fighting or cussing or other types of casual adolescent misbehavior, she was surprisingly lenient. There were two things, though, that she gave no quarter to: lying and eavesdropping. The way she reprimanded the children in the event of either of these infractions, you would have thought they were the first two of the 10 Commandments. Early Sunday afternoon was Kenny's favorite time of the week. Saturdays were for hard work, a day to prepare for tomorrow's strict adherence to the Lord's mandate of rest. For Kenny, Sunday afternoon was like a mini summer vacation before the week began over again. Kenny and Buddy, the family hound, had spent the warm afternoon on the banks of Edgewood Creek under the lush groves that separated the north end of their property from Old Man Gentry's southern cornfields. Kenny swam and caught crawdads while Buddy foraged through thick groves of chaparral, sending chittering flocks flying from the underbrush. They lazed in the dappled shade of the oaks and elms and dozed as they listened to the breeze rustle through the canopy, carrying the scent of a passing summer and a fast-approaching fall. Kenny woke with a start. He tried to sit up and found himself pinned under Buddy's heavy head. He stroked his muzzle before pushing him off. Buddy barely noticed and let out a great huffing snore as he stretched his neck and settled his head against the pillow of the thick grass that grew above the loam of the banks. Kenny sat up and rubbed the sleep from his eyes, blinking as he remembered where he was. The grove had grown silent, save the babbling of the unseasonably fat creek. The birds were nesting in the last of the afternoon's warmth. The winds had moved north, blowing through the fields of drying corn stalks, rattling like wind chimes fashioned from hollow bones and chaff. A wave of panic ran through Kenny. How long had he been asleep? He knew home before supper meant home in time to help set and serve. He pushed himself up and dusted the sand from the seat of his pants. As he pulled and shook at the edges of his shirt, he squinted through the foliage at the low-lying sun. "Come on, boy." Kenny towed at Buddy's belly. Buddy stretched and sat up with a curly-tongued yawn. He snorted, turned a droopy eye up to Kenny, and wagged his tail. Kenny pulled his shoes over his bare, sandy feet. "Hope we're not late." He waved for Buddy to follow and dove through the shrubs along the overgrown trail. They bounded through the tall golden grass and onto the dusty drive. Kenny could see that the truck was still out, which meant that his dad and brothers weren't back from fishing. Hunting was not allowed on Sundays, as it was too close to actual work. Fishing, on the other hand, was begrudgingly tolerated by their mom after a compromise was met. Catch and release only. "We must be pretty early, Buddy." Kenny slowed and shoved his hands in his pockets and kicked at rocks as he meandered up the road. He didn't want to be too early. Buddy zigged and zagged along behind him. As the farmhouse grew near, Kenny spotted the blue Buick parked in the shade of the great oak in the front yard. Pastor Jensen's car. If the pastor was still visiting, then he had gotten home much earlier than he had originally suspected. Kenny and Buddy skirted the yard through the firewood cache, around the chicken coops and across the tractor yard to the barn. Buddy waddled into the barn and headed to the stalls, where he liked to doze against the doors of the pens. Kenny made his way into the backyard, peering through the picture window into the living room as he passed. He saw his mother, Pastor Jensen, the pastor's wife, and Miss Krantz, the town librarian, hunkered in their seats as they conferred. Kenny swung his arms and kicked at a rock as he made his way to the tire swing that hung under the dome of the willow. He climbed on top of the tire and swung his feet as he got it moving back and forth in sweeping arcs that grew longer before starting to subside. He stared out over the rolling hills and let the swing finally come to a slowly spinning rest. He eyed the back door to the kitchen. His stomach grumbled. He had worked half of yesterday with his mother in the kitchen and could picture the hunk of cheese in the cold box that his mother had hastily stored while cleaning up. If some of it were to go missing, he doubted anyone would notice. Kenny tiptoed up the 3 steps, pulled the screen open, and peered through the growing crack in the door as he pushed it slowly. The well-oiled hinges groaned but let out no betraying squeal. The coast was clear. He stepped into the kitchen and softly shut the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment while he listened. Murmurings from the living room. No steps. Kenny crept across the kitchen and stopped in front of the fridge, his eyes darting over his shoulder as he raised the lid. He found, portioned, and rehid the cheese in record time, a chunk for his back pocket as he nibbled on a smaller morsel. As he passed the entrance of the dining room that led off through to the living room, he turned an ear, making sure the coast was clear. There were no footfalls, but there was something else. Something eerie. He had heard them pray and sing hymnals. He had heard them debate scripture and noticed how the pastor's voice had turned to a lilting sing-song timbre that even Kenny could tell was performative. He had heard a lot of strange things during church meetings, but this was different. Something he'd never heard before. Something that sounded with a sinister, sibilant hiss. Kenny shoved the last of the cheesy morsel in his mouth and sucked on it slowly as he crept to the threshold of the dining room. He leaned against the molded casing, staying hidden behind it as he closed his eyes and strained to hear. The words floated to him, a hushed chant. He, by whose hand the land does turn, cleansing the field of vermin and scourge, and seed and chaff and stalk and stern. We hail his flame, the residue burn. He felt his skin crawl. Before he could open his eyes and creep away, he felt the familiar vice-like grip of a small hand on his shoulder. He yipped, even though everything in him urged him to cry out loudly. He turned to find the angry eyes of their mother and quickly hung his head. Even as he stared at her feet, he could imagine the flames of rage licking up from the dark of her pupils. Kenneth, Robert. Somehow, she always made that middle name sting. Kenny could remember wincing at the sound of her using his siblings' middle names to reprimand them. Are you eavesdropping? He thought about lying for only the barest moment before letting the truth tumble out. Yes, ma'am. If you keep listening in, you're going to grow another ear. She grasped his elbow and drew him close as she gathered her composure. Do not listen to the words of others. Kenny knew the words of Ecclesiastes 7:21, and even at his young age he understood that his mother was using the verse out of context. Years ago, he remembered her scolding Adam, his middle brother, in the same fashion. Adam had completed the rest of the verse to her and then pointed out that he had no servants. This had sent their mother into a silent rage that resulted in Adam being essentially shackled to the barn and corral performing chores for the better part of 2 months. Yes, ma'am. Kenny peered up at her as he tried to convey the greatest amount of contrition he could muster. Her stern gaze softened, just a little. You've pilfered from the cold case. Kenny hung his head again. This time the notion of lying had passed faster. Yes, ma'am. She narrowed an appraising gaze. He squirmed. Fine. She waved toward the stairs. Keep the cheese. Kenny glanced up at her nervously. In return, you will review your studies until you are called for dinner. A glint of surprise flashed across Kenny's face. He nodded enthusiastically. Yes, ma'am. Then softer, with a bow. Thank you, Mom. She crossed her arms and tapped her toe. Kenny gave her a final nod and quickly headed through the pantry and up to his room. After dinner, Kenny cleaned so late into the evening that by the time he got to bed, he barely had 10 minutes to peruse his latest edition of Scary Science before lights out. All 3 boys shared a room. Adam and Ben, the eldest, shared the bunk bed, Adam relegated to the top. Kenny's small, single bed was tucked into the corner. Kenny laid in the dark, listening to his brothers whispering back and forth, catching only every third word of the fishtails of the day. As he listened, he swore he overheard Ben say, "Grow another ear." Kenny's voice sounded gravely and a little too loud in his ears. "Hey, guys!" His brothers became instantly silent. The room filled with the soft hush of the wind against the window, blowing through the fields. The faraway knock of a loose shutter. "Guys!" The wind for a moment before he heard Adam snicker. Kenny rolled his eyes in the dark. "What's up, Ken?" Ben asked. Kenny could hear his warm smile. Mom said I'd grow another ear if I eavesdrop on folks. Silence from his brothers. Kenny thought about what he was really asking. That's not true, right? At first it sounded like the wind against the window, but Kenny grew to realize that it was the sound of his brothers stifling their laughter. He rolled his eyes and resigned to accept that they were jerks. His older brother Ben spoke calmly, only the slightest guarded tremble of levity in his voice. Is that what you got in trouble for? Eavesdropping? Yeah, Kenny sighed. He pulled on the lobes of his ears and muttered, I don't want another ear. More stifled laughter. Ben's calm voice, Don't worry, Ken. Those are just stories. Kenny huffed. He knew stuff like that wasn't real. I don't know. Adam interrupted the comfortable moment. Depends who you're eavesdropping on. Ben was the first to ask, I don't know. Adam considered taking a breath. If you're walking down the street, or you're in a place, it's not your fault. People are just talking, right? Ben and Kenny nodded along in the dark. But if you listen in on important things, then it's different. Then you're breaking some sort of sin. He held up a finger. That's when you get cursed and grow extra ears. Ben scoffed quietly. Kenny didn't hear anything important. He directed his whispers to Kenny. Who'd you eavesdrop on? Mom. Chuckles. No, Pastor Jensen. A cold silence washed over the room. Kenny gulped. Were they chanting? Ben's tone was stark. Kenny's brothers could hear him nod. Same as the G-Zip kid, Adam added ominously. Oh, yeah. Kenny could hear Ben tapping the banister as he remembered. Billy, right? That's right. Adam spoke with the timbre of collusion. The kid couldn't help himself. He listened in on everyone. He listened in on Pastor Jensen, too. The next morning he woke up and, wouldn't you know it, he had another ear on his cheek. Kenny rubbed his cheek. He couldn't tell if it was really tingling or if he was imagining it. Geez! Ben exclaimed under his breath. Adam added, what Kenny suspected might be a performative amount of gravitas to his reedy voice. Before he was growing ears from everywhere, and one night he ran into the cornfield and turned into a cornstalk. Ears coming out everywhere. Oh, boy! Kenny heard Ben shake his head. That's not even the scariest part. Oh, Ben asked in practiced surprise. The worst part, no one could find him. They even searched the fields. Walked right by, calling his name. But he was a cornstalk, so they couldn't tell. And at the end of the year, they burned him with the chaff. Whoa, Ben! Kenny pulled the covers to his chin and stared, wide-eyed, into the dark. He knew the fires well. To him, it seemed like a pretty rotten way to go. He could see Billy Jensen turn to a stalk of corn jutting from the fields of stumps and bent stalks. Then he squinted as he thought of an odd notion, and without thinking he just muttered aloud, Do you think they harvest Billy Jensen? He heard his brothers suck in a breath, like the hush of the surf retreating, before both of his brothers burst out with a donkey's guffaw. He heard them slap their hands over their mouths, and all three of them froze. Before the count of three, their mother's steps were on the landing. The door flew open, a slab of light cutting through the dark of the room. If I hear another peep. All three brothers held their breath, shutting their eyes tight. Their mom let out a harumph and appraised them for another moment before shutting the door. The three of them willed themselves to sleep. That night Kenny had a dream. He woke in the night and laid in the dark as he listened. His brothers snored and a soft wind shook the window panes. He raised his head. The gap under the door was dark. He remembered the cheese. He sat up in bed and swung his feet over the side and listened again. Snores and windy thumps. Kenny crept through the dark, down the stairs and into the kitchen. He pulled the cold storage open and rifled through it. There was more cheese than he remembered, and he took more than he needed. As he filled his pockets with dry curds, he heard a bark echo through the night outside. Through the kitchen window across the western fields, he saw Buddy's silhouette, arched and crooning at the cornfields. From the tattered remains of the crop, an orange light glowed. Kenny found himself in the western field, wading through the grass toward the spent corn rows. Buddy was gone, but the glow had grown warmer, and a wind had risen, carrying with it a chant. Weed and vermin, stalk and stern, hail the flames. The residue burn. Kenny pushed a broken stalk aside as he stepped into the waste of the harvested field. A glow in the distance. He felt an itch behind his ear. He scratched at it and found a protrusion, a lump. The lump grew, and he felt itching sensations explode all over his body, and as he felt at them, he discovered more growing protrusions. He stumbled toward the glow, his feet sticking. The lumps pushed through his skin and his body stiffened and thinned. His feet rooted. The protrusions burst from his body into ears of corn as he stiffened into a grotesquely contorted pose. Flames began to grow around him. A robed union stood before him, chanting, "Weed and vermin, stalk and stern." The firelight lit the faces under their hoods. His mother chanting, the wet reflection of the flames dancing in her eyes. Hail the flames. The residue burn. Flames rose and engulfed him as he tried to scream. Kenny bolted upright with a shout, pulling the covers away and wiping the sweat from his face. He braced himself as he caught his breath, one foot draped over his bedside. He glanced around the room, gathering his dark surroundings. He let out a sigh of relief. He was safe in his room, his brothers snoring away, a soft wind rattling the window, the rustle of fall outside. He took a deep breath and fell back into bed. He tucked himself in, poking at his pillow and wiping the last of the sweat from his face. As his hand passed over his nose, he felt something, a lump. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories. Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Beth was eagerly preparing for her first all-night sleepover party. Even though she was in 6th grade, her parents had never let her have a sleepover before this point. Beth was so excited. She sat in front of her mirror, carefully applying makeup to her pale face and curling her messy blonde hair into perfect spirals. She rummaged through her closet, trying to decide what to wear, before finally settling on a dark red dress with maroon ruffles. The dress was very pretty and brought a smile to Beth's face. Beth looked through her vanity, attempting to find a suitable nail polish. She painted her nails slowly, taking extra care to not smudge the polish. Finally, with all 10 nails painted to perfection, Beth leaned back in her chair and waited patiently for the polish to dry. She watched as the colors deepened and solidified, the glitter catching the light and casting dancing shadows across the room. After a few minutes, she tentatively touched one of her nails to see if the polish was dry. Satisfied, she smiled to herself, admiring the way the red and gold glitter complemented her skin tone. With her appearance sorted, Beth headed downstairs to get everything ready. She rummaged through the cabinet, finding an assortment of snacks, and carefully setting them out where they were easily accessible to her guests. Feeling that something was missing, Beth went down to her basement, ignoring the shiver that ran down her spine. The basement was dark and musty, with so many boxes that it was hard to locate what she was looking for. But after about 10 minutes of searching, Beth finally found it. She grabbed an old dusty wooden board, feeling a sense of excitement and apprehension as she did so. The board had been passed down from her great-grandmother and was rumored to be a tool for communicating with the dead. Despite feeling watched and a little scared, Beth set the board in a corner where no one would see it, determined to try it out later. She knew that it would give her friends a true fright, and she couldn't wait to see their reactions. With everything ready, Beth went back up to her room to await the arrival of her guests, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness for the night ahead. As the guests began arriving, Beth could barely contain her excitement. Soon, everyone was enjoying snacks and talking together. Beth was having the time of her life at her birthday party. She had planned everything to perfection, and all her friends were having a great time. Even Sarah, who was usually reserved, was laughing and making jokes with the rest of the group. Beth had a special surprise planned for her friends in the basement. She had spent days preparing for this moment, and she couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces. As they made their way down the stairs, Sarah gasped at the sight of the many boxes that filled the room. Curiosity got the best of her, and she asked, "What's in all of these boxes, Beth?" Beth grinned mischievously and replied, "This used to be a newspaper shop run by a family who sold newspapers. But one day, their daughter disappeared without a trace." Sarah shivered but didn't say anything more. One of Beth's other friends picked up a random newspaper from a box. The headline read, "Ouija boards, is it safe?" Beth couldn't help but smile. Her plan was already working. She was going to scare her friends like never before. But soon, the girls forgot all about the foreboding news article. They began to share stories about whatever came to their minds. The sleepover was in full swing, with the girls enjoying themselves. Suddenly, Beth pulled out an Ouija board, and Sarah felt uneasy, especially after hearing about the girl who had disappeared. Despite her hesitation, the girls decided to give it a try, placing their fingers on the board and following the guide's instructions. The stone moved and landed on yes when they asked if there was anyone with them. Sarah asked for the spirit's name, and the stone spelled out Cindy. The girls looked at each other, perplexed, and asked why Cindy was there. The stone spelled out, "I died here," sending a chill down the girls' spines. Perhaps the story about the newspaper family that had once lived here was true. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and Beth felt a cold hand on her shoulder. The girls sensed that they were being watched, and they quickly hurried back to Beth's room, trying to pretend that nothing had happened. It was just an innocent game, after all. However, at midnight, they heard soft laughter. Footsteps seemed to be approaching the door, and a small child appeared at the door, glowing bright silver. The girls were terrified, watching as the child walked closer. The ghost of Cindy spoke in a chilling, giggling voice and said, "Oh, no, have you had a fright? That's why you don't use my board at night." The doll-like figure flew towards them, screaming madly. The girls were terrified and tried to flee, but it was too late. They were trapped, and the spirit had them in its grasp. The next day, Beth's parents found no sign of the girls, except for the Ouija board on goodbye and a note that read, "It wasn't so innocent after all." Beth's parents looked everywhere, but they couldn't find a trace. They did, however, find a small news article in the basement. The headline read, "Young girl disappears. Body still not found." The mysterious disappearance of the girls who participated in the sleepover remains unsolved to this day. However, the events of that night taught us a valuable lesson that we should never forget. No matter how harmless a game may appear at first glance, it can always have a dark and dangerous side to it. And never, never use an Ouija board at night, as it can potentially invite malevolent spirits into our world. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. For the most wild, yet most homely narrative, which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die. Today I would unburthen my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In the consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I would attempt to expound them. To me they have presented little but horror. To many they will seem less terrible than baroque. Hereafter perhaps some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace, some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy, I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and, in my manhood, I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasions to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black, and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusions to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. Our pets, of course, were made to feel a change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol, and at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old, and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home, much intoxicated, from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when, and derided my violence, inflicted a side wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. Our original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fibre of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse for the crime of which I had been guilty. But it was, at best, a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, 'tis true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, a spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit, philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul is, than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not, 100 times, found himself committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination, in the teeth of our best judgment, to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue, and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cool blood, I slipped a noose about its neck, and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes, and with the bitterest remorse at my heart. Hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin, that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts, and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which addressed the head of my bed. The plastering had here, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall, a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager attention. The words strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas-relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme, but at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by some one of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown, through an open window, into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames, and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did none the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me, among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species, and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. One night, as I sat half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object, reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it of the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and, when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When I reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature. A certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty, preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it. But gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was a discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. The circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair, or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet, and thus nearly throw me down, or, fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own, that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention, more than once, to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had, at length, assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster, had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. O mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. And now was I indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to look out for me, a man, fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter, I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while, from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me, upon some household errand, into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs and, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, and, forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed to blow at the animal, which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended, as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box as if merchandise, with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection, caused by a false chimney, or fireplace, that had been filled up, and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar I easily dislodged the bricks, and, having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair, with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly, and said to myself, "Here at least, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had, at length, firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it, at the moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate. But it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep, the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, Since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a freeman. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dog deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came, very unexpectedly, into the house, and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom, and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied, and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say but one word, by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health, and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house." And a rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls— Are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together. And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with the cane which I held in my hand, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in their damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon his head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories. Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. When I drew nigh the nameless city, I knew it was accursed. I was traveling in a parched and terrible valley under the moon, and afar I saw it protruding uncannily above the sands, as parts of a corpse may protrude from an ill-made grave. Fear spoke from the age-worn stones of this hoary survivor of the deluge, this great-grandfather of the eldest pyramid. And a viewless aura repelled me, and bade me retreat from antique and sinister secrets that no man should see, and no man else had dared to see. Remote in the desert of Araby lies the nameless city, crumbling and inarticulate, its low walls nearly hidden by the sands of uncounted ages. It must have been thus before the first stones of Memphis were laid, and while the bricks of Babylon were yet unbaked. There is no legend so old as to give it a name, or to recall that it was ever alive. But it is told of in whispers around campfires, and muttered about by grandams in the tents of sheiks, so that all the tribes shun it without wholly knowing why. It was of this place that Abdul al-Hazred, the mad poet, dreamed of the night before he sang his unexplained couplet, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons death may die." I should have known that the Arabs had good reason for shunning the nameless city, the city told of in strange tales but seen by no living man. Yet I defied them, and went into the untrodden waste with my camel. I alone have seen it, and that is why no other face bears such hideous lines of fear as mine, why no other man shivers so horribly when the night wind rattles the windows. When I came upon it in the ghastly stillness of unending sleep, it looked at me, chilly from the rays of a cold moon amidst the desert's heat. And as I returned its look, I forgot my triumph at finding it, and stopped still with my camel to wait for the dawn. 4 hours I waited, till the east grew gray and the stars faded, and the gray turned to roseate light edged with gold. I heard a moaning, and saw a storm of sand stirring among the antique stones, though the sky was clear, and the vast reaches of desert still. Then suddenly, above the desert's far rim, came the blazing edge of the sun, seen through the tiny sandstorm which was passing away. And in my fevered state, I fancied that from some remote depth there came a crash of musical metal to hail the fiery disk, as Memnon hails it from the banks of the Nile. My ears rang, and my imagination seethed as I led my camel slowly across the sand to that unvocal place, that place which I alone of living men had seen. In and out amongst the shapeless foundations of houses and places I wandered, finding never a carving or inscription to tell of these men, if men they were, who built this city and dwelt therein so long ago. The antiquity of the spot was unwholesome, and I longed to encounter some sign or device to prove that the city was indeed fashioned by mankind. There were certain proportions and dimensions in the ruins which I did not like. I had with me many tools, and dug much within the walls of the obliterated edifices. But progress was slow, and nothing significant was revealed. When night and the moon returned, I felt a chill wind which brought new fear, so that I did not dare to remain in the city. And as I went outside the antique walls to sleep, a small sighing sandstorm gathered behind me, glowing over the gray stones, though the moon was bright, and most of the desert still. I awakened just at dawn from a pageant of horrible dreams, my ears ringing as from some metallic peal. I saw the sun peering redly through the last gusts of a little sandstorm that hovered over the nameless city and marked the quietness of the rest of the landscape. Once more I ventured within those brooding ruins, wondered at the sources of its greatness. To myself, I pictured all the splendors of an age so distant that Chaldea could not recall it, and thought of Sarnath the Doomed, that stood in the land of Manar when mankind was young, and of Ib, that was carven of grey stone before mankind existed. All at once I came upon a place where the bedrock might preserve many secrets of ages too remote for calculation, though sandstorms had long effaced any carvings which may have been outside. Very low and sand-choked were all the dark apertures near me, but I cleared one with my spade and crawled through it, carrying a torch to reveal whatever mysteries it might hold. When I was inside, I saw that the cavern was indeed a temple, and beheld plain signs of the race that had lived and worshipped before the desert was a desert. Primitive altars, pillars, and niches, all curiously low. When I had seen all that the place contained, I crawled out again, avid to find what the temples might yield. Night had now approached, yet the tangible things I had seen made curiosity stronger than fear, so that I did not flee from the long moon-cast shadows that had daunted me when first I saw the nameless city. In the twilight, I cleared another aperture and with a new torch crawled into it, finding more vague stones and symbols, though nothing more definite than the other temple had contained. The room was just as low, but much less broad, ending in a very narrow passage crowded with obscure and cryptical shrines. About these shrines I was prying, when the noise of a wind and my camel outside broke through the stillness and drew me forth to see what could have frightened the beast. The moon was gleaming vividly over the primitive ruins, lighting a dense cloud of sand that seemed blown by a strong but decreasing wind from some point along the cliff ahead of me. I knew it was this chilly, sandy wind which had disturbed the camel, and was about to lead him to a place of better shelter, when I chanced to glance up and saw that there was no wind atop the cliff. This astonished me and made me fearful again, but I immediately recalled the sudden local winds that I had seen and heard before at sunrise and sunset, and judged it was a normal thing. I decided it came from some rock fissure leading to a cave, and watched the troubled sand to trace it to its source, soon perceiving that it came from the black orifice of a temple a long distance south of me, almost out of sight. Against the choking sand cloud I plodded toward this temple, which, as I neared it, loomed larger than the rest, and showed a doorway far less clogged with caked sand. I would have entered had not the terrific force of the icy wind almost quenched my torch. It poured madly out of the dark door, sighing uncannily as it ruffled the sand and spread among the weird ruins. Soon it grew fainter, and the sand grew more and more still, till finally all was at rest again. But a presence seemed stalking among the spectral stones of the city, and when I glanced at the moon, it seemed to quiver, as though mirrored in unquiet waters. I was more afraid than I could explain, but not enough to dull my thirst for wonder. So as soon as the wind was quite gone, I crossed into the dark chamber from which it had come. This temple, as I had fancied from the outside, was larger than either of those I had visited before, and was presumably a natural cavern, since it bore winds from some region beyond. Here I could stand quite upright, but saw that the stones and altars were as low as those in the other temples. On the walls and roof I beheld for the first time some traces of the pictorial art of the ancient race, curious curling streaks of paint that had almost faded or crumbled away. And on two of the altars I saw with rising excitement a maze of well-fashioned curvilinear carvings. As I held my torch aloft, it seemed to me that the shape of the roof was too regular to be natural, and I wondered what the prehistoric cutters of stone had first worked upon. Their engineering skill must have been vast. Then a brighter flare of the fantastic flame showed that form which I had been seeking, the opening to those remoter abysses whence the sudden wind had blown. And I grew faint when I saw that it was a small and plainly artificial door chiseled in the solid rock. I thrust my torch within, beholding a black tunnel with the roof arching low over a rough flight of very small, numerous, and steeply descending steps. I shall always see those steps in my dreams, for I came to learn what they meant. At the time, I hardly knew whether to call them steps or mere footholds in a precipitous descent. My mind was whirling with mad thoughts, and the words and warning of Arab prophets seemed to float across the desert from the land that men know to the nameless city that men dare not know. Yet I hesitated only for a moment before advancing through the portal and commencing to climb cautiously down the steep passage, feet first, as though on a ladder. It is only in the terrible phantasms of drugs or delirium that any other man can have such a descent as mine. The narrow passage led infinitely down like some hideous haunted well, and the torch I held above my head could not light the unknown depths towards which I was crawling. I lost track of the hours and forgot to consult my watch, though I was frightened when I thought of the distance I must be traversing. There were changes of direction and of steepness, and once I came to a long, low, level passage where I had to wriggle my feet first along the rocky floor, holding torch at arm's length beyond my head. The place was not high enough for kneeling. After that were more of the steep steps, and I was still scrambling down interminably when my failing torch died out. I do not think I noticed it at the time, for when I did notice it, I was still holding it above me as if it were ablaze. I was quite unbalanced with that instinct for the strange and unknown, which had made me a wanderer upon the earth and a haunter of far, ancient, and forbidden places. In the darkness, there flashed before my mind fragments of my cherished treasury of demonic lore, sentences from Al-Hazred, the mad Arab, paragraphs from the apocryphal nightmares of Damascus, and infamous lines from the delirious Image du Monde of Gautier de Metz. I repeated queer extracts, and muttered of Afrasiab and the demons that floated with him down the Oxus. Later, chanting over and over again a phrase from one of Lord Dunsany's tales, the unreverberate blackness of the abyss. Once, when the descent grew amazingly steep, I recited something in sing-song from Thomas Moore, until I feared to recite more. A reservoir of darkness black, as witches' cauldrons are when filled, with moon-drugs in the cliffs distilled, leaning to look if foot might pass. Down through that chasm I saw beneath, as far as vision could explore, the jetty sides as smooth as glass, looking as if just varnished o'er. With that dark pitch the seat of death throws out upon its slimy shore. Time had quite ceased to exist when my feet again felt a level floor, and I found myself in a place slightly higher than the rooms in the two smaller temples, now so incalculably far above my head. I could not quite stand, but could kneel upright, and in the dark I shuffled and crept hither and thither at random. I soon knew that I was in a narrow passage, whose walls were lined with cases of wood having glass fronts. As in that Paleozoic and abysmal place I felt of such things as polished wood and glass, I shuddered at the possible implications. The cases were apparently ranged along each side of the passage at regular intervals, and were oblong and horizontal, hideously like coffins in shape and size. When I tried to move 2 or 3 for further examination, I found that they were firmly fastened. I saw that the passage was a long one, so floundered ahead rapidly in a creeping run that would have seemed horrible had any eye watched me in the blackness, crossing from side to side occasionally to feel of my surroundings, and be sure the walls and rows of cases still stretched on. Man is so used to thinking visually that I almost forgot the darkness, and pictured the endless corridor of wood and glass in its low-studded monotony as though I saw it. And then, in a moment of indescribable emotion, I did see it. Just when my fancy merged into real sight, I cannot tell. But there came a gradual glow ahead, and all at once I knew that I saw the dim outlines of a corridor and the cases, revealed by some unknown subterranean phosphorescence. For a little while, all was exactly as I had imagined it, since the glow was very faint. But as I mechanically kept stumbling ahead into the stronger light, I realized that my fancy had been but feeble. This hall was no relic of crudity like the temples in the city above, but a monument of the most magnificent and exotic art. Rich, vivid, and daringly fantastic designs and pictures formed a continuous scheme of mural paintings whose lines and colors were beyond description. The cases were of a strange golden wood, with fronts of exquisite glass, and containing the mummified forms of creatures outreaching in grotesqueness the most chaotic dreams of man. To convey any idea of these monstrosities is impossible. They were of the reptile kind, with body lines suggesting sometimes the crocodile, sometimes the seal, and more often nothing of which either the naturalist or the paleontologist ever heard. In size they approximated a small man, and their forelegs bore delicate and evident feet, curiously like human hands and fingers. But strangest of all were their heads, which presented a contour violating all known biological principles. To nothing can such things be well compared. In one flash, I thought of comparisons as varied as the cat, the bullfrog, the mythic satyr, and the human being. Not Jove himself had had so colossal and protuberant a forehead. Yet the horns and the noselessness and the alligator-like jaw placed things outside all established categories. I debated for a time on the reality of the mummies, half suspecting they were artificial idols, but soon decided they were indeed some Paleogean species which had lived when the nameless city was alive. To crown their grotesqueness, most of them were gorgeously enrobed in the costliest of fabrics, and lavishly laden with ornaments of gold, jewels, and unknown shining metals. The importance of these crawling creatures must have been vast, for they held first place among the wild designs on the frescoed walls and ceiling. With matchless skill had the artists drawn them in a world of their own, wherein they had cities and gardens fashioned to suit their dimensions. And I could not help but think that their pictured history was allegorical, perhaps showing the progress of the race that worshipped them. These creatures, I said to myself, were to men of the nameless city what the she-wolf was to Rome, or some totem beast is to a tribe of Indians. Holding this view, I could trace roughly a wonderful epic of the nameless city, the tale of a mighty seacoast metropolis that ruled the world before Africa rose out of the waves, and of its struggles as the sea shrank away and the desert crept into the fertile valley that held it. I saw its wars and triumphs, its troubles and defeats, and afterwards its terrible fight against the desert when thousands of its people, here represented in allegory by the grotesque reptiles, were driven to chisel their way down through the rocks in some marvelous manner to another world whereof their prophets had told them. It was all vividly weird and realistic, and its connection with the awesome descent I had made was unmistakable. I even recognized the passages. As I crept along the corridor toward the brighter light, I saw later stages of a painted epic, the leave-taking of the race that had dwelt in the nameless city and the valley around for 10 million years. The race whose souls shrank from quitting scenes their bodies had known so long, where they had settled as nomads in the earth's youth, hewing in the virgin rock those primal shrines at which they had never ceased to worship. Now that the light was better, I studied the pictures more closely, and, remembering that the strange reptiles must represent the unknown men, pondered upon the customs of the nameless city. Many things were peculiar and inexplicable. The civilization, which included a written alphabet, had seemingly risen to a higher order than those immeasurably later civilizations of Egypt and Chaldea. Yet, there were curious omissions. I could, for example, find no pictures to represent deaths or funeral customs, save such as were related to wars, violence, and plagues. And I wondered at the reticence shown concerning natural death. It was as though an ideal of immortality had been fostered as a cheering illusion. Still nearer the end of the passage was painted scenes of the utmost picturesqueness and extravagance, contrasted views of the nameless city in its desertion and growing ruin, and of the strange new realm of paradise to which the race had hewed its way through the stone. In these views, the city and the desert valley were shown always by moonlight, golden nimbus hovering over the fallen walls, and half revealing the splendid perfection of former times, shown spectrally and elusively by the artist. The paradisal scenes were almost too extravagant to be believed, portraying a hidden world of eternal day, filled with glorious cities and ethereal hills and valleys. At the very last, I thought I saw signs of an artistic anticlimax. The paintings were less skillful and much more bizarre than even the wildest of the earlier scenes. They seemed to record a slow decadence of the ancient stock, coupled with a growing ferocity toward the outside world from which it was driven by the desert. The forms of the people, always represented by the sacred reptiles, appeared to be gradually wasting away, though their spirit, as shown hovering above the ruins by moonlight, gained in proportion. Emaciated priests, displayed as reptiles in ornate robes, cursed the upper air and all who breathed it, and one terrible final scene showed a primitive-looking man, perhaps a pioneer of ancient Iram, the city of pillars, torn to pieces by members of the elder race. I remembered how the Arabs fear the nameless city, and was glad that beyond this place the gray walls and ceiling were bare. As I viewed the pageant of mural history, I had approached very closely to the end of the low-ceiled hall, and was aware of a gate through which came all of the illuminating phosphorescence. Creeping up to it, I cried aloud in transcendent amazement at what lay beyond. For instead of other and brighter chambers, there was only an illimitable void of uniform radiance, such one might fancy when gazing down from the peak of Mount Everest upon a sea of sunlit mist. Behind me was a passage so cramped that I could not stand upright in it. Before me was an infinity of subterranean effulgence. Reaching down from the passage into the abyss was the head of a steep flight of steps. Small, numerous steps like those of black passages I had traversed. But after a few feet, the glowing vapors concealed everything. Swung back open against the left-hand wall of the passage was a massive door of brass, incredibly thick and decorated with fantastic bas-reliefs, which could, if closed, shut the whole inner world of light away from the vaults and passages of rock. I looked at the steps, and for the nonce dared not try them. I touched the open brass door and could not move it. Then I sank prone to the stone floor, my mind aflame with prodigious reflections which not even a death-like exhaustion could banish. As I lay still with closed eyes, free to ponder, many things I had lightly noted in the frescoes came back to me with new and terrible significance. Scenes representing the nameless city in its heyday, the vegetations of the valley around it, and the distant lands with which its merchants traded. The allegory of the crawling creatures puzzled me by its universal prominence, and I wondered that it would be so closely followed in a pictured history of such importance. In the frescoes, the nameless city had been shown in proportions fitted to the reptiles. I wondered what its real proportions and magnificence had been, and reflected a moment on certain oddities I had noticed in the ruins. I thought curiously of the lowness of the primal temples and of the underground corridor, which were doubtless hewn thus out of deference to the reptile deities there honored, though it perforce reduced the worshippers to crawling. Perhaps the very rites here involved crawling, in imitation of the creatures. No religious theory, however, could easily explain why the level passages in that awesome descent should be as low as the temples, or lower, since one could not even kneel in it. And as I thought of the crawling creatures, whose hideous mummified forms were so close to me, I felt a new throb of fear. Mental associations are curious, and I shrank from the idea that, except for the poor primitive man torn to pieces in the last painting, mine was the only human form amidst the many relics and symbols of the primordial life. But, as always in my strange and roving existence, wonder soon drove out fear, for the luminous abyss and what it might contain presented a problem worthy of the greatest explorer. That a weird world of mystery lay far down that flight of peculiarly small steps I could not doubt, and I hoped to find there those human memorials which the painted corridor had failed to give. The frescoes had pictured unbelievable cities and valleys in this lower realm, and my fancy dwelt on the rich and colossal ruins that awaited me. My fears indeed concerned the past rather than the future. Not even the physical horror of my position in that cramped corridor of dead reptiles and antediluvian frescoes miles below the world I knew, and faced by another world of eerie light and mist, could match the lethal dread I felt at the abysmal antiquity of the scene and its soul. An ancientness so vast that measurement is feeble seemed to leer down from the primal stones and rock-hewn temples of the nameless city, while the very latest of the astounding maps in the frescoes showed oceans and continents that man has forgotten, with only here and there some vaguely familiar outlines of what could have happened in the geological ages since the painting ceased and the death-hating race resentfully succumbed to decay. No man might say. Life had once teemed in these caverns and in the luminous realm beyond. Now I was alone with vivid relics, and I trembled to think of the countless ages through which these relics had kept a silent, deserted vigil. Suddenly, there came another burst of that acute fear which had intermittently seized me ever since I first saw the terrible valley and the nameless city under a cold moon. And, despite my exhaustion, I found myself starting frantically to a sitting posture, and gazing back along the black corridor toward the tunnels that rose to the outer world. My sensations were like those which had made me shun the nameless city at night, and were as inexplicable as they were poignant. In another moment, however, I received a still greater shock in the form of a definite sound, the first which had broken the utter silence of these tomb-like depths. It was a deep, low moaning, as of a distant throng of condemned spirits, and came from the direction in which I was staring. Its volume rapidly grew, till it soon reverberated frightfully through the low passage, and at the same time I became conscious of an increasing draught of cold air, likewise flowing from the tunnels and the city above. The touch of this air seemed to restore my balance, for I instantly recalled the sudden gusts which had risen around the mouth of the abyss each sunset and sunrise, one of which had indeed revealed the hidden tunnels to me. I looked at my watch and saw that sunrise was near, so braced myself to resist the gale that was sweeping down to its cavern home as it had swept forth that evening. My fear again waned low, since a natural phenomenon tends to dispel broodings over the unknown. More and more madly poured the shrieking, moaning night wind into the gulf of the inner earth. I dropped prone again, and clutched vainly at the floor, for fear of being swept bodily through the open gate into the phosphorescent abyss. Such fury I had not expected, and as I grew aware of an actual slipping of my form toward the abyss, I was beset by 1,000 new terrors of apprehension and imagination. The malignancy of the blast awakened incredible fancies. Once more, I compared myself shudderingly to the only human image in that frightful corridor, the man who was torn to pieces by the nameless race. For, in the fiendish clawing of the swirling currents, there seemed to abide a vindictive rage, all the stronger because it was largely impotent. I think I screamed frantically near the last. I was almost mad. But if I did so, my cries were lost in the hell-born babble of the howling wind-wraiths. I tried to crawl against the murderous invisible torrent, but I could not even hold my own, as I was pushed slowly and inexorably toward the unknown world. Finally, reason must have wholly snapped, for I fell to babbling over and over that unexplainable couplet of the mad Arab Alhazred, who dreamed of the nameless city. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. Only the grim, brooding desert gods know what really took place, what indescribable struggles and scrambles in the dark I endured, or what Abaddon guided me back to life, where I must always remember and shiver in the night wind till oblivion, or worse, claims me. Monstrous, unnatural, Colossal was the thing, too far beyond all the ideas of man to be believed, except in the silent, damnable small hours of the morning when one cannot sleep. I have said that the fury of the rushing blast was infernal, cacodemoniacal, that its voices were hideous with the pent-up viciousness of desolate eternities. Presently these voices, while still chaotic before me, seemed to my beating brain to take articulate form behind me, and down there in the grave of unnumbered eon-dead antiquities, leagues below the dawn-lit world of men, I heard the ghastly cursing and snarling of strange-tongued fiends. Turning, I saw, outlined against the luminous ether of the abyss, what could not be seen against the dusk of the corridor. A nightmare horde of rushing devils, hate-distorted, grotesquely panoplied, half-transparent devils of a race no man might mistake. The crawling reptiles of the nameless city. And as the wind died away, I was plunged into the ghoul-pooled darkness of earth's bowels. For, behind the last of the creatures, the great brazen door clanged shut, with a deafening peal of metallic music, whose reverberation swelled out to the distant world to hail the rising sun, as Memnon hails it from the banks of the Nile. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories. Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Willis had met Miss Hollister but once, and that, for a certain purpose, was sufficient. He was smitten. She represented, in every way, his ideal, although, until he had met her, his ideal had been something radically different. She was not at all Juno-esque, and the maiden of his dreams had been decidedly so. She had auburn hair, which hitherto Willis had detested. Indeed, if the same hirsute wealth had adorned some other woman's head, Willis would have called it red. This shows how completely he was smitten. She changed his point of view entirely. She shattered his old ideal and set herself up in its stead, and she did most of it with a smile. There was something, however, about Miss Hollister's eyes that contributed to the smiling of Willis's heart. They were great, round, lustrous orbs, and deep. So deep were they, and so penetrating, that Willis's affections were away beyond their own depth the moment Miss Hollister's eyes looked into his, and at the same time he had a dim and slightly uncomfortable notion that she could read every thought his mind held within its folds, or rather, that she could see how utterly devoid of thought that mind was upon this ecstatic occasion. For Willis's brain was set all agog by the sensations of the moment. "By Jove," he said to himself afterwards. For Willis, wise man that he could be on occasions, was his own confidant, to the exclusion of all others. "By Jove, I believe she can peer into my very soul. And if she can, my hopes are blasted, for she must be able to see that a soul like mine is no more worthy to become the affinity of one like hers than a mountain rill can hope to rival the Amazon." Nevertheless, Willis did hope. Something may turn up, and perhaps I can devise some scheme by means of which my imperfections can be hidden from her. Maybe I can put stained glass over the windows of my soul and keep her from looking through them at my shortcomings. Smoked glasses, perhaps. And why not? If smoked glasses can be used by mortals gazing at the sun, why may they not be used by me when gazing into those scarcely less glorious orbs of hers? Alas for Willis, the fates were against him. A far-off tribe of fates were in league to blast his chances of success forever, and this was how it happened. Willis had occasion one afternoon to come uptown early. At the corner of Broadway and Astor Place, he entered a Madison Avenue car, paid his fare, and sat down in one of the corner seats at the rear end of the car. His mind was, as usual, intent upon the glorious Miss Hollister. Surely no one who had once met her could do otherwise than think of her constantly, he reflected, and the reflections made him a bit jealous. What business had others to think of her? Impertinent, groveling mortals! No man was good enough to do that. No, not even himself. But he could change. He could at least try to be worthy of thinking about her. And he knew of no other man who could. He'd like to catch anyone else doing so little as mentioning her name. Impertinent, groveling mortals, he repeated. And then the car stopped at 17th Street, and who should step on board but Miss Hollister herself? The idea, thought Willis. By Jove, there she is, on a horse car, too. How atrocious! One might as well expect to see Minerva driving in a grocer's wagon as Miss Hollister in a horse car. Miserable, untactful world to compel Minerva to ride in a horse cart, or rather Miss Hollister to ride in a grocer's car. Absurdest of absurdities. Here he raised his hat, for Miss Hollister had bowed sweetly to him as she passed on to the far end of the car, where she stood hanging onto a strap. I wonder why she doesn't sit down, thought Willis. For as he looked about the car, he observed that with the exception of the one he occupied, all the seats were vacant. In fact, the only persons on board were Miss Hollister, the driver, the conductor, and himself. I think I'll go speak to her, he thought. And then he thought again. No, I'd better not. She saw me when she entered, and if she had wished to speak to me, she would have sat down here beside me, or opposite me, perhaps. I shall show myself worthy of her by not thrusting my presence upon her. But I wonder why she stands. She looks tired enough. Here Miss Hollister indulged in a very singular performance. She bowed her head slightly at someone, apparently on the sidewalk, Willis thought, murmured something, the purport of which Willis could not catch, and sat down in the middle of the seat on the other side of the car, looking very much annoyed. In fact, almost unamiable. Willis was more mystified than ever. But his mystification was as nothing compared to his anxiety when, on reaching 42nd Street, Miss Hollister rose and, sweeping by him without a sign of recognition, left the car. Cut, by thunder! Ejaculated Willis in consternation. And why, I wonder? Most incomprehensible affair. Can she be a woman of whims, with eyes like those? Never. Impossible. And yet, what else can be the matter? Try as he might, Willis could not solve the problem. It was utterly past solution as far as he was concerned. I'll find out, and I'll find out like a brave man, he said, after racking his brains for an hour or two in a vain endeavor to get at the cause of Miss Hollister's cut. I'll call upon her tonight and ask her. He was true to his first purpose, but not to his second. He called, but did not ask her, for Miss Hollister did not give him the chance to do so. Upon receiving his card, she sent down word that she was out. 2 days later, meeting him face to face upon the street, she gazed coldly at him and cut him once more. 6 months later, her engagement to a Boston man was announced, and in the autumn following, Miss Hollister of New York became Mrs. Barrows of Boston. There were cards, but Willis did not receive one of them. The cut was indeed complete and final. But why? That had now become one of the great problems of Willis's life. What had he done to be so badly treated? A year passed by, and Willis recovered from the dreadful blow to his hopes. But he often puzzled over Miss Hollister's singular behavior towards him. He had placed the matter before several of his friends, and with the exception of one of them, none was more capable of solving his problem than he. This one had heard from his wife, a school friend and intimate acquaintance of Miss Hollister, now Mrs. Barrows, that Willis's ideal had once expressed herself to the effect that she had admired Willis very much, until she had discovered that he was not always as courteous as he should be. Courteous? Not as courteous as I should be, retorted Willis. When have I ever been anything else? Why, my dear Bronson, he added, you know my attitude towards womankind, as well as mankind, has always been. If there is a creature in the world whose politeness is his weakness, I am that creature. I am the most courteous man living. When I play poker in my own rooms, I lose money, because I've made it a rule never to beat my guests in cards or anything else. That isn't politeness, said Bronson. That's idiocy. It proves my point, retorted Willis. I'm polite to the verge of insanity. Not as courteous as I should be. Great Scott! What did I ever do or say to give her that idea? I don't know, Bronson replied. Better ask her. Maybe you overdid your politeness. Overdone courtesy is often worse than boorishness. You may have been so polite on some occasion that you made Miss Hollister think you considered her an inferior person. You know what the poet insinuated, Sorosis holds no fury like a woman condescended to by a man. I've half a mind to write Mrs. Barrows and ask her what I did, said Willis. That would be lovely, said Bronson. Barrows would be pleased. True, I never thought of that, replied Willis. You are not a thoughtful thinker, said Bronson dryly. If I were you, I'd bide my time, and some day you may get an explanation. Stranger things have happened, and my wife tells me that the Barrowses are about to spend the coming winter in New York. You'll meet them out somewhere, no doubt. No, I shall decline to go where they are. No woman shall cut me a second time, not even Mrs. Barrows, said Willis firmly. Good. Stand by your color, said Bronson with an amused smile. A week or two later, Willis received an invitation from Mr. and Mrs. Bronson to dine with them informally. I have some very clever friends I want you to meet, she wrote, so be sure to come. Willis went. The clever friends were Mr. and Mrs. Barrows, and to the surprise of Willis, he was received most effusively by the quondam Miss Hollister. Why, Mr. Willis, she said, extending her hand to him, how delightful to see you again. Thank you, said Willis in some confusion. I am sure it is a very pleasant surprise for me. I had no idea. Nor I, returned Mrs. Barrows, and really, I should have been a little embarrassed, I think, had I known you were to be here. It's so very absurd that I almost hesitate to speak of it, but I feel I must. I have treated you very badly. Indeed, said Willis with a smile. How, pray? Well, it wasn't my fault, really, returned Mrs. Barrows. But do you remember, a little over a year ago, my riding uptown on a horse car, a Madison Avenue car, with you? Said Willis, with an affectation of reflection. Let me see. Yes, I think I do. We were the only ones on board, I believe, and, here Mrs. Barrows laughed outright. You thought we were the only ones on board, but we weren't. The car was crowded, she said. Then I don't remember it, said Willis. The only time I ever rode on a horse car with you, to my knowledge, was— I know. This was the occasion, interrupted Mrs. Barrows. You sat in a corner at the rear end of the car when I entered, and I was very much put out with you because it remained for a stranger whom I had often seen and to whom I had, for reasons unknown even to myself, taken a deep aversion, to offer me his seat, and what is more, compel me to take it. I don't understand, said Willis. We were alone on the car. To your eyes we were, although at the time I did not know it. To my eyes, when I boarded it, the car was occupied by enough people to fill all the seats. You returned my bow as I entered, but did not offer me your seat. The stranger did, and while I tried to decline it, I was unable to do so. He was a man of about my own age, and he had a most remarkable pair of eyes. There was no resisting them. His offer was a command, and as I rode along and thought of your sitting motionless at the end of the car, compelling me to stand, and being indirectly responsible for my acceptance of courtesies from a total and disagreeable stranger, I became so very indignant with you that I passed you without recognition as soon as I could summon up courage to leave. I could not understand why you, who had seemed to me the soul of politeness, should upon this occasion have failed to do not what I should exact from any man, but what I had reason to expect of you. But Mrs. Barrows, remonstrated Willis, why should I give up a seat to a lady when there were 20 other seats unoccupied on the same car? There is no reason in the world why you should, replied Mrs. Barrows, but it was not until last winter that I discovered the trick that had been put upon us. Ah, said Willis, trick? Yes, said Mrs. Barrows, it was a trick. The car was empty to your eyes, but crowded to mine with the astral bodies of the members of the Boston Theosophical Society. What? Roared Willis. It is just as I have said, replied Mrs. Barrows with a silvery laugh. They are all great friends of my husband's, and one night last winter he dined with them at our house, and who do you suppose walked in first? Madame Blavatsky's ghost, suggested Willis with a grin. Not quite, returned Mrs. Barrows, but the horrible stranger of the horse car. And do you know, he recalled the whole thing to my mind, assuring me that he and the others had projected their astral bodies over to New York for a week, and had a magnificent time unperceived by all save myself, who was unconsciously psychic, and so able to perceive them in their invisible forms. It was a mean trick on me, Mrs. Barrows, said Willis ruefully, as soon as he had recovered sufficiently from his surprise to speak. Oh, no, she replied, with a repetition of her charming laugh, which re-aroused in Willis's breast all the regrets of a lost cause. They didn't intend it especially for you anyhow. Well, said Willis, I think they did. They were friends of your husband's, and they wanted to ruin me. Ruin you? And why should the friends of Mr. Barrows have wished to do that? Asked Mrs. Barrows in astonishment. Because, began Willis slowly and softly, because they probably knew that from the moment I met you, But that is a story with a disagreeable climax, Mrs. Barrows, so I shall not tell it. How do you like Boston? The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories. Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. I do not assert that what I am about to relate is, in all its particulars, absolutely true. Not understand me that it is not true, but I do not feel that I care to make an assertion that is more than likely to be received by a skeptical age with sneers of incredulity. I will content myself with a simple narration of the events of that evening, the memory of which is so indelibly impressed upon my mind, and which, were I able to do so, I should forget without any sentiments of regret whatsoever. The affair happened on the night before I fell ill of typhoid fever, and is about the sole remaining remembrance of that immediate period left to me. Briefly, the story is as follows. Notwithstanding the fact that I was overworked in the practice of my profession, it was early in March, and I was preparing my contributions for the coming Christmas issues of the periodicals for which I write. I had accepted the highly honorable position of entertainment committeeman at one of the small clubs to which I belong. I accepted the office, supposing that the duties connected with it were easy of performance, and with absolutely no notion that the faith of my fellow committeemen in my judgment was so strong that they would ultimately manifest a desire to leave the whole program for the club's diversion in my hands. This, however, they did, and when the month of March assumed command of the calendar, I found myself utterly fagged out and at my wits' end to know what style of entertainment to provide for the club meeting to be held on the evening of the 15th of that month. I had provided already an unusually taking variety of evenings, of which one in particular, called the Martyr's Night, in which living authors writhed through selections from their own works, while an inhuman audience, every man of whom had suffered even as the victims then suffered, sat on 10 score of camp stools, puffing the smoke of 25 score of free cigars into their faces, and gloating over their misery, was extremely successful, and had gained for me among my professional brethren the enviable title of Machiavelli Jr. This performance, in fact, was the one now uppermost in the minds of the club members, having been the most recent of the series, and it had been prophesied by many men whose judgment was unassailable that no man, not even I, could ever conceive of anything that could surpass it. Disposed at first to question the accuracy of a prophecy to the effect that I was, like most others of my kind, possessed of limitations, I came finally to believe that perhaps, after all, these male Cassandras with whom I was thrown were right. Indeed, the more I racked my brains to think of something better than Martyr's Night, the more I became convinced that in that achievement I had reached the zenith of my powers. The thing for me to do now was to hook myself securely onto the zenith and stay there. But how to do it? That was the question which drove sleep from my eyes and deprived me for a period of 6 weeks of my reason, my hair departing immediately upon the restoration thereof, a not uncommon after-symptom of typhoid. It was a typical March night, this one upon which the extraordinary incident about to be related took place. It was the kind of night that novelists use when they are handling a mystery that in the abstract would amount to nothing, but which in the concrete of a bit of wild, weird, and windy nocturnalism sends the reader into hysterics. It may be, I shall not attempt to deny it, that had it happened upon another kind of an evening, a soft, mild, balmy June evening, for instance, my own experience would have seemed less worthy of preservation in the amber of publicity. But of that, the reader must judge for himself. The fact alone remains that upon the night when my uncanny visitor appeared, the weather department was apparently engaged in getting rid of its remnants. There was a large percentage of withering blast in the general makeup of the evening, There were rain and snow which alternated in pattering upon my window pane and whitening the apology for a wold that stands 3 blocks from my flat on Madison Square. The wind whistled as it always does upon occasions of this sort, and from all corners of my apartment, after the usual fashion, there seemed to come sounds of a supernatural order, the effect of which was to send cold chills off on their regular trips up and down the spine of their victim, in this instance myself. I wish at the time the hackneyed quality of these sensations had appealed to me. That it did not do so was shown by the highly nervous state in which I found myself as my clock struck 11. If I could only have realized at that hour that these symptoms were the same old threadbare premonitions of the appearance of a supernatural being, I should have left the house and gone to the club, and so have avoided the visitation then imminent. Had I done this, I should doubtless also have escaped the typhoid, since the doctors attributed that misfortune to the shock of my experience, which, in my then wearied state, I was unable to sustain. And what the escape of typhoid would have meant to me, only those who have seen the bills of my physician and druggist for services rendered and prescriptions compounded are aware. That my mind unconsciously took thought of spirits was shown by the fact that when the first chill came upon me, I arose and poured out for myself a stiff bumper of old reserve rye, which I immediately swallowed. But beyond this I did not go. I simply sat there before my fire and cudgeled my brains for an idea whereby my fellow members at the Gutenberg Club might be amused. How long I sat there I do not know. It may have been 10 minutes. It may have been an hour. I was barely conscious of the passing of time. But I do know that the clock in the Dutch Reformed Church steeple at 29th Street and 5th Avenue was clanging out the first stroke of the hour of midnight when my doorbell rang. Heretofore, if I may be allowed the word, the tintinnabulation of my doorbell had been invariably pleasing unto me. I am fond of company, and company alone was betokened by its ringing, since my creditors gratify their passion for interviews at my office, if perchance they happen to find me there. But on this occasion, I could not at the moment tell why, its clanging seemed the very essence of discord. It jangled with my nervous system, and as it ceased I was conscious of a feeling of irritability which is utterly at variance with my nature outside of business hours. In the office, for the sake of discipline, I frequently adopt a querulous manner, finding it necessary in dealing with office boys. But the moment I leave the shop behind me, I become a different individual entirely, and have been called a moteless sunbeam by those who have seen only that side of my character. This, by the way, must be regarded as a confidential communication, since I am at present engaged in preparing a vest-pocket edition of the philosophical works of Schopenhauer, in words of 1 syllable, and were it known that the publisher had entrusted the magnificent pessimism of that illustrious juggler of words and theories to a moteless sunbeam, it might seriously interfere with the sale of the work. And I may say, too, that this request that my confidence be respected is entirely disinterested, insomuch as I decline to do the work on the royalty plan, insisting upon the payment of a lump sum, considerably in advance. But to return, I heard the bell ring with a sense of profound disgust. I did not wish to see anybody.